I'm Jessica Martinez, 29 years old, and I work as a software engineer here in Phoenix, Arizona. 3 weeks ago, my parents showed up at my downtown loft with tears in their eyes, begging me to lend them $40,000 to save their house from foreclosure. The same parents who had borrowed my savings account dry over the years to bail out my sister Amanda's endless financial disasters. The same parents who told me I was being selfish when I finally changed my bank account passwords last year. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. But what happened next will shock you even more. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in Scottsdale, Arizona, our family looked like the perfect American success story from the outside. My dad, Bob Martinez, worked as an insurance adjuster, spending his days assessing claims and helping people rebuild after disasters. My mom, Linda, worked as a bank teller at Wells Fargo, handling other people's money with precision and care. We lived in a 3-bedroom house with a small pool in the backyard, 2 cars in the driveway, and neighbors who waved hello every morning. From the street, we looked stable, middle class, living the suburban dream. But behind our beige stucco walls, there was a financial dynamic that would shape my entire relationship with money, family, and self-worth. Amanda, my younger sister by 4 years, was what you'd call a free spirit. Even as a kid, she had this magnetic personality that drew people in. She was the one who organized neighborhood talent shows, convinced our parents to let her paint her bedroom walls hot pink, and somehow always managed to talk her way out of chores with a smile and a joke. I, on the other hand, was the quiet one, the planner, the kid who did homework without being asked and kept a neat room because it made me feel in control. Our parents seemed to see these personality differences as fixed destinies. Amanda was the creative one who needed support and understanding, while I was the responsible one who could handle anything life threw at me. The first time I remember noticing the pattern, I was 8 years old. I had been saving my allowance for months, carefully placing each $5 bill into a pink ceramic piggy bank shaped like a cat. I wanted to buy a beginner's coding kit I'd seen at Target, one of those simple programming games that teaches kids basic logic. It cost $30, and I was almost there, having saved $26 over 6 months of doing extra chores and finding loose change around the house. I was so proud of that little pile of crumpled bills and shiny quarters. Then Amanda, who was only 4 at the time, saw a princess costume at the mall that she absolutely had to have. It was elaborate, with layers of tulle and plastic jewels sewn into the bodice, and it cost $45. When Mom said we couldn't afford it right then, Amanda threw herself on the floor of the Disney store and began sobbing dramatically. Other shoppers stared as she wailed about how she needed it for princess practice at home. I watched Mom's face soften, then turn to me with that look I would come to know so well, the look that said I was about to be asked to sacrifice something for Amanda's happiness. "Jess, honey," Mom said, crouching down to my level, "you know how much Amanda loves princess things. Could you maybe lend Mommy some of your piggy bank money? We'll pay you back next week, I promise." I stared at her, feeling something twist in my stomach. $26 would leave me $4 short of my coding kit, but it would buy Amanda's costume with money left over. I wanted to say no, but the way Mom looked at me, hopeful, expectant, like I was the mature one who understood family sacrifice, made me nod. I went home and cracked open my ceramic cat, watching months of careful saving disappear into Amanda's immediate desire. Next week never came, of course. When I asked about the money a few days later, Mom looked confused for a moment before remembering. "Oh, sweetie, we're a little tight right now. Dad's car needed new tires. But you don't really need that coding thing right away, do you? You're so smart, you'll figure out computers without it." Amanda twirled past us in her princess dress, completely oblivious to the transaction that had made her joy possible. That was the first time I learned that my wants were always postponable, while Amanda's were urgent emergencies that required immediate family mobilization. The pattern repeated itself in countless variations over the years. When I was 10 and wanted to join the school's computer club, which required a $20 fee for materials and software access, Dad said the budget was too tight that month. 2 weeks later, Amanda announced she wanted to take horseback riding lessons, which cost $80 a month. Suddenly, the budget had flexibility. Amanda's been through a rough patch at school, Mom explained when I pointed out the discrepancy. She needs this confidence boost. You're doing fine academically, you don't need extra activities. The message was clear: my success meant I deserved less support, while Amanda's struggles meant she deserved more. By middle school, I had internalized this logic completely. When Amanda wanted a new bike because hers was babyish, I offered to give her mine and said I didn't mind walking to school. When she decided she hated her bedroom furniture and needed a complete makeover, I suggested we could move my desk into the garage so she could have more space. I had become an expert at anticipating what Amanda might need and preemptively offering to give it up. It felt good, in a twisted way, to be seen as the generous, mature sister who always put family first. High school brought new challenges and new opportunities for the family dynamic to assert itself. I had discovered that I had a real talent for mathematics and computer programming. My algebra teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, pulled me aside after class one day during my sophomore year and told me I should consider taking advanced computer science courses and maybe even dual enrollment at the community college. She saw something in me that I was just beginning to see in myself, a logical mind that could solve complex problems, and a persistence that kept me working on coding challenges long after other students gave up. I was excited about the possibility of taking college-level programming courses while still in high school. It would give me a head start on a computer science degree and maybe even help me earn college credits. But the dual enrollment program cost $300 per semester, plus books and transportation to the community college campus twice a week. When I brought home the paperwork and explained the opportunity to my parents, Dad's first response was to whistle low and shake his head. $300? That's a lot of money, Jess. Are you sure this is something you really need? I tried to explain how it could save money in the long run by letting me graduate college faster, how it would look good on applications, how Mrs. Rodriguez said I had real potential in this field. But I could see their expressions shifting into that familiar pattern of polite interest masking financial anxiety. Let us think about it, Mom said, which I had learned was usually code for "we'll hope you forget about this." Meanwhile, Amanda had discovered photography and announced that she wanted to be a professional photographer someday. She needed a good digital camera, she explained, and she'd found the perfect one online for $800. It had all the features a serious photographer required, and her art teacher had said she had a real eye for composition. Unlike my programming courses, which were presented as an expensive luxury, Amanda's camera was framed as an investment in her artistic future. I watched the family budget meeting happen in real time over dinner one night. Dad expressed concern about the cost, but Mom pointed out that Amanda's grades had been improving since she'd gotten interested in photography. Maybe if she has her own professional equipment, she'll take it more seriously, Mom said. It could be exactly what she needs to find her passion.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
By the end of the meal, they had decided that Amanda's camera was a worthwhile investment, while my dual enrollment courses were tabled for maybe next year. The unfairness of it hit me like a physical blow. Amanda's interest in photography was 3 weeks old, sparked by an Instagram influencer she followed, while I had been passionate about computers for years and had actual academic validation from a teacher. But her needs were immediate and emotional, while mine were long-term and practical. The family had learned to respond to Amanda's emotional intensity while taking my steady reliability for granted. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I got a job at a local coffee shop, working after school and on weekends, determined to pay for the dual enrollment courses myself. If my family couldn't see the value in investing in my education, I would invest in myself. I was 15 years old, and I was already learning that I could only count on myself to make my dreams happen. The coffee shop job was my first real taste of independence, even though I was still living at home and dependent on my parents for basic needs. I worked 15 hours a week, mainly during the busy afternoon rush when office workers needed their caffeine fix and students came in to study. The work was hard, dealing with demanding customers, memorizing complicated drink orders, staying on my feet for hours at a time, but it was also empowering. For the first time in my life, I was earning money that belonged entirely to me. I opened my own savings account at a different bank than where Mom worked, determined to keep my earnings private. Every paycheck, I deposited 90% of what I earned, keeping only a small amount for gas money and the occasional movie with friends. I had calculated exactly how much I needed to save for the dual enrollment courses, and I was determined to reach that goal by the start of my junior year. But keeping money secret in our family turned out to be nearly impossible. Mom worked at a bank, so she understood financial systems better than most people. She noticed when I wasn't asking for money for things I used to request: lunch money, gas for my car, small purchases at the mall. "You're being very responsible with money lately," she observed one day, in that tone parents use when they're fishing for information. "I'm just trying to save up for college," I replied, which was technically true but not the whole story. I didn't mention the dual enrollment courses because I didn't want to have another conversation about how expensive they were or how we'd need to think about it some more. As my savings account grew, so did the family's financial pressures. Amanda had started her senior year of high school with grand plans for her future as a photographer. She had convinced our parents to buy her the $800 camera, but now she realized she needed additional equipment: lenses, a tripod, editing software, lighting equipment. Each new need was presented as essential for her artistic development, and each purchase put more strain on the family budget. The first time my parents asked to borrow money from my savings, it was presented as a temporary emergency. Amanda had been accepted to a summer photography workshop in Sedona that cost $1,500, but the deposit was due immediately, and they wouldn't get paid for another 2 weeks. "We'll pay you back as soon as Dad's check comes in," Mom promised. This is such an amazing opportunity for Amanda. She's finally found something she's passionate about. I was hesitant, but $1,500 was exactly what I had managed to save over 8 months of working at the coffee shop. It represented every rushed shift between homework assignments, every sore foot from standing behind the espresso machine, every weekend I'd chosen work over hanging out with friends. But I was also 17 years old, still living in my parents' house, still dependent on their support in countless ways. How could I say no to a family emergency? I transferred the money to their account, and Amanda went to her photography workshop. She came back with hundreds of photos and stories about the professional photographers she'd met. "This is exactly what I want to do with my life," she announced. "I've found my calling." For a moment I felt good about having helped make her realization possible. Maybe this was how families were supposed to work: everyone contributing what they could when someone needed support. But 2 weeks turned into a month, and a month turned into 3 months, and the promised repayment never materialized. When I finally worked up the courage to ask about it, Mom looked surprised, as if she'd forgotten about the loan entirely. "Oh honey, we're still catching up from that workshop expense. And now Amanda needs money for her college portfolio. Can you be patient a little longer?" Amanda's college portfolio required professional printing of her photographs, which cost $300, plus application fees for art schools, plus a new laptop, because her old one couldn't handle the photo editing software she needed. Each expense built on the last, creating an endless cycle of Amanda's needs consuming the family's financial resources. My $1,500 had disappeared into this black hole of artistic investment, and I was back to having an empty savings account despite months of work. The most frustrating part was that nobody seemed to see the pattern except me. Amanda genuinely believed she was pursuing her dreams, and my parents genuinely believed they were supporting her artistic development. I was the only one who noticed that every family financial crisis seemed to involve Amanda needing something expensive right away, and every solution seemed to involve me giving up something I had worked for. I increased my hours at the coffee shop and started babysitting on weekends, determined to rebuild my savings faster than my family could spend them. But it was like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom. Just as I'd get a few $100s saved, Amanda would have another crisis. Her car needed repairs, she'd gotten a credit card and maxed it out, she'd signed up for an expensive photography course without asking permission first, and suddenly my parents were asking for another temporary loan. Each time, the request was framed as a family emergency that required immediate action. Each time, I was reminded of how responsible and mature I was, how much my parents appreciated my willingness to help, how this was what families did for each other. Each time, I found myself saying yes because the alternative, letting Amanda's crisis go unsolved, felt impossible. How could I have money sitting in the bank while my sister struggled? By the time I graduated high school, I had loaned my parents over $4,000, and I hadn't seen a penny of it returned. My dual enrollment courses had become a distant dream, something I'd given up so quietly that I'm not sure my family even remembered I'd ever wanted to take them. I had learned to stop mentioning my goals and dreams, because they always seemed selfish in comparison to Amanda's immediate needs. But I had also learned something else. I was capable of earning substantial amounts of money through my own efforts. While my classmates were asking their parents for gas money and movie tickets, I had been supporting myself and contributing to my family's finances for 3 years. I had developed a work ethic and financial discipline that would serve me well in college, even if I was starting with an empty bank account. Arizona State University offered me a partial academic scholarship based on my grades and test scores, but I still needed to cover room, board, and the remaining tuition costs. My parents, who had just finished paying for Amanda's first year at an expensive art college in California, explained that they had nothing left to contribute to my education. "You've always been so good with money," Dad said. "We know you'll figure out how to make it work." It was the same logic that had governed my entire childhood. Because I was responsible and capable, I deserved less help, not more. Amanda's needs were urgent and emotional, requiring immediate family intervention, while my needs were practical and long-term, something I could be expected to handle on my own. I nodded and smiled, and told them I understood, but inside I was calculating how many hours I'd need to work to pay for college, while also maintaining the grades necessary to keep my scholarship. The summer before college, I worked 60 hours a week split between the coffee shop and a new job doing data entry for a small business. I lived on ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches, saved every penny I could, and tried not to think about how much easier this would have been if I still had the $4,000 I'd loaned to my parents over the years. But I also felt a strange sense of pride in my independence. I was 18 years old, and I was funding my own future through sheer determination and hard work. Amanda, meanwhile, was loving her art college experience, but struggling with the practical aspects of being away from home. She called home several times a week with new financial emergencies. She needed money for art supplies, her meal plan wasn't enough food, her roommate had moved out and she couldn't afford the dorm room by herself. Each crisis required immediate wire transfers from our parents' increasingly strained bank account. The pattern continued into my college years, but now the amounts were bigger, and the consequences more serious. Amanda decided to study abroad in Italy for a semester, which cost $8,000 beyond her regular tuition. When my parents couldn't cover the full amount, they asked if I could contribute from my college savings. "It's such an incredible opportunity," Mom explained over the phone. She'll be studying Renaissance art in the place where it was created. How can we let her miss this chance? I was sitting in my dorm room, surrounded by textbooks I'd bought used to save money, eating my third consecutive dinner of microwave noodles because I'd run out of meal plan dollars for the week. The idea of giving up my carefully saved emergency fund so Amanda could have a European adventure felt impossible, but it also felt impossible to say no when my parents made it clear that Amanda's dream semester was in my hands. I said yes, as I always did, and watched another chunk of my savings disappear into Amanda's endless artistic journey. She sent postcards from Rome and Florence, sharing photos of herself standing in front of famous sculptures and paintings. "This experience is changing my life," she wrote. "I'm learning so much about art and about myself. Thank you for making this possible." Her gratitude felt genuine, and for a moment I wondered if I was being petty to resent the financial sacrifice. Maybe this was just what family meant. Sometimes you gave up your own opportunities to make someone else's dreams come true. Maybe the problem wasn't with Amanda or my parents, but with my own selfishness and wanting to keep money for myself when someone I loved needed it more. But late at night, when I was exhausted from working and studying, and still worrying about how to pay next semester's tuition, the resentment would creep back in. Amanda was having life-changing experiences in Italy while I was missing out on the normal college experience because I had to work so many hours to support myself. She was discovering herself through art, while I was discovering just how little my family valued my dreams compared to hers. The breaking point came during my junior year, when I was finally starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel. My computer science grades were excellent. I had landed a paid internship at a tech company in Phoenix, and I was starting to think about my post-graduation plans. I had even managed to rebuild my savings account to nearly $3,000, money I was planning to use for graduate school applications and interview travel. Then Amanda called with the biggest crisis yet. She had graduated from art college, but was struggling to find work as a photographer. She had credit card debt, student loans, and rent on an expensive apartment in Los Angeles, where she was trying to break into the entertainment industry. She needed $15,000 to consolidate her debts and give herself time to build her photography business without the pressure of immediate financial obligations. $15,000 was more money than I had ever seen in one place. It was more than my parents could possibly loan, more than any single emergency had ever cost before. But Amanda presented it as a make-or-break moment for her career, the difference between giving up on her dreams and becoming the successful artist she was meant to be. "I've never asked for this much before," she said during a tearful phone call, "but I've also never been this close to making it. I have meetings with potential clients, I'm building a portfolio, but I can't focus on my art when I'm worried about money every second. This loan would change everything for me." My parents called me separately to explain how desperate the situation was. Amanda was talking about moving back home and giving up photography entirely, which would make her expensive art education a complete waste. They had already taken out a second mortgage on their house to help with her previous emergencies, but they couldn't do more without risking their own financial stability. "We hate to ask this of you," Mom said, "but you're the only one in a position to help. Your job is going so well, and you've always been so good at managing money. This could be the thing that finally gets Amanda on her feet so she won't need help anymore." The promise that this would be the last time, that this loan would solve Amanda's problems permanently, was what finally convinced me. I had been lending money to my family for 7 years, and I had never seen any of it returned, but maybe this time was different. Maybe $15,000 was enough to actually solve the underlying problem instead of just postponing it. I emptied my savings account, took out a personal loan to cover the difference, and wired Amanda the money she needed. She cried with gratitude, promising to pay me back as soon as her photography business took off. "You're saving my life," she said. "I'll never forget this." For a few months it seemed like the investment might actually pay off. Amanda's social media was full of posts about new clients, creative projects, and her growing reputation in the Los Angeles photography scene. She seemed happier and more confident than I had ever seen her, finally living the artistic life she had always dreamed of. But then the calls started again. Amanda's photography business lasted exactly 6 months before the next crisis hit. This time she called me at 2 in the morning, sobbing so hard I could barely understand what she was saying. Between gasps and hiccups, I pieced together the story. She had been dating another photographer named Marcus, they had decided to start a joint studio together, and she had invested another $8,000 of credit card money into equipment and studio rent. Now Marcus had disappeared with half their equipment, her credit cards were maxed out again, and she was facing eviction from both her apartment and the studio space. I sat up in my bed, staring at the dark ceiling of my Phoenix apartment, feeling that familiar knot form in my stomach. It was the same feeling I'd had as an 8-year-old watching my piggy bank money disappear, the same helpless recognition that Amanda's crisis was about to become my problem. But this time felt
different, bigger, more desperate than anything before. "Jess, I know I still owe you money from last time," Amanda said through her tears, "but I'm going to lose everything. The landlord says if I don't pay the back rent by Friday, he's calling the police. I'll have to live in my car. I can't ask Mom and Dad for more money after everything they've already done. You're the only person who can help me." The manipulation in her words was so familiar I almost didn't notice it anymore. Amanda had perfected the art of making her emergencies sound like matters of life and death, while simultaneously acknowledging my previous generosity just enough to make me feel guilty for hesitating. She knew exactly which emotional buttons to push to get me to open my wallet, and after years of practice, she had it down to a science. But what struck me most wasn't Amanda's predictable crisis or her practiced desperation. It was the casual way she mentioned that our parents had already done everything they could. I realized that in all these years of lending Amanda money, I had never asked the hard questions about our parents' finances. I had assumed they were contributing equally to these bailouts, that my loans were supplementing their support rather than replacing it entirely. "What do you mean they've already done everything they can?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral despite the suspicion growing in my chest. Amanda's sobbing quieted for a moment, and I could hear her calculating how much to reveal. "Well, you know they took out that second mortgage to help me get started in LA, and Dad's been sending me money every month for my car payment, and they paid off my credit cards twice last year. They're stretched pretty thin right now." Each revelation hit me like a separate punch to the gut. A second mortgage on their house, monthly car payments, credit card bailouts that happened twice in 1 year, not just the once I had heard about. My parents had been funding Amanda's lifestyle far more extensively than I had ever realized, while simultaneously asking me to contribute my own savings to her endless emergencies. I started doing rough math in my head, adding up the amounts I knew about plus these new revelations. Over the past 3 years alone, my parents had probably given Amanda close to $50,000 in direct support, not counting the personal loans and credit card payments. Meanwhile, they had contributed exactly $0 to my college education, my living expenses, or my career development. The financial disparity wasn't just unfair, it was staggering. "How much do you need this time?" I asked, though I already knew the answer would be more than I had saved. "Just $12,000, Amanda said quickly, as if the word just made it reasonable. "That would cover the back rent, the studio deposit I'll lose, and enough to get me back on my feet. I swear this is the last time, Jess. Once I get through this rough patch, I'll be able to pay you back everything I owe you." $12,000. Added to the $15,000 I had already loaned her plus the smaller amounts over the years, Amanda would owe me close to $30,000. It was more money than most people my age had ever seen, certainly more than I could afford to lose as a recent college graduate still paying off my own student loans. But as I sat there in the dark, phone pressed to my ear, listening to my sister's sobs, I felt trapped by the same dynamic that had controlled my entire childhood. If I said no, Amanda would be homeless. If I said no, my parents would be disappointed in me for not helping family.
If I said no, I would be the selfish sister who had money but refused to share it with someone in desperate need. I agreed to help, but this time I insisted on conditions. I would loan her the money, but she had to agree to financial counseling. She had to provide me with a detailed budget showing how she planned to pay me back. She had to get a part-time job to supplement her photography income, and she had to acknowledge, in writing, that this was a loan with a repayment schedule, not a gift. Amanda agreed to everything immediately, promising to be more responsible, swearing this was truly the last time she would need help. Within hours, I had transferred $12,000 from my savings account to hers, watching my post-graduation emergency fund disappear in a single transaction. The financial counseling lasted exactly one session. Amanda claimed the counselor was judgmental and didn't understand the creative industry. The detailed budget never materialized beyond a rough sketch on a napkin during a phone call. The part-time job lasted 3 weeks before Amanda decided it was interfering with her networking opportunities. And the written repayment agreement became a source of family tension when Amanda told our parents I was treating her like a stranger instead of a sister. Within 2 months, Amanda had new financial problems that made the previous crisis look small. Her car had been repossessed because she'd missed 3 payments, despite Dad supposedly covering that expense. She owed her photographer friends money for equipment she had borrowed and damaged. She was behind on her phone bill, her internet bill, and her car insurance. Each problem was presented as urgent and interconnected. She couldn't work without a car, couldn't get clients without a phone, couldn't edit photos without internet. The solutions, as always, required immediate financial intervention from family members who cared about her well-being. But this time, when my parents called to discuss Amanda's latest crisis, I started asking different questions. Instead of focusing on how we could solve her problems, I wanted to understand how she kept getting into the same situations despite repeated bailouts. I don't understand, I said during a family conference call that included Amanda. We've given you thousands of dollars over the past few years. Where is that money going? The question hung in the air for a moment, and I could sense everyone's discomfort. It was the kind of direct inquiry that our family had learned to avoid, the type of practical concern that felt harsh and unsupportive when someone was in crisis. It goes to living expenses, Amanda said defensively. Do you think I'm spending it on luxury items? I'm barely surviving here, but as we talked more, the details of her barely surviving lifestyle started to emerge. She lived in a trendy neighborhood in West Hollywood, where rent for her one-bedroom apartment cost $3,000 a month. She leased a BMW because she believed having a nice car was essential for her professional image. She ate most of her meals at restaurants and coffee shops because her apartment had a tiny kitchen that wasn't conducive to cooking. She maintained memberships at an expensive gym and yoga studio because physical fitness was important for her mental health and creativity. Each individual expense could be justified in isolation, but together they painted a picture of someone living far beyond her means while expecting her family to subsidize the difference. Amanda had created a lifestyle that required a 6-figure income, but she was earning maybe $20,000 a year from her photography work. The math simply didn't work, and no amount of family loans could bridge that gap sustainably. Maybe you need to consider a different living situation, I suggested carefully. There are cheaper neighborhoods in LA, or you could get a roommate, or maybe move somewhere with a lower cost of living while you build your business. The suggestion was met with immediate resistance from both Amanda and my parents. Moving to a cheaper area would hurt Amanda's professional prospects, they argued. Getting a roommate might interfere with her creative process. Leaving LA entirely would mean abandoning all the connections she had worked so hard to build. Every practical solution I proposed was dismissed as impossible or counterproductive, but nobody could explain how Amanda's current situation was sustainable. It was like being asked to solve a math problem where the fundamental equation was impossible, but being told that changing any of the variables was unacceptable. That's when I realized that my family wasn't actually trying to solve Amanda's financial problems. They were trying to manage them, to keep her afloat in an unsustainable lifestyle by continuously infusing cash from external sources. My parents had cast themselves as the loving supporters who would do anything for their daughter's dreams, and they had cast me as the successful sibling who should feel grateful for the opportunity to help. The dynamic had become a closed loop where Amanda's crises justified increasingly desperate measures from the rest of us, but the underlying causes of those crises were never addressed. She spent more than she earned, so we gave her money. The money enabled her to continue spending more than she earned, which inevitably led to the next crisis. Our help wasn't solving anything, it was perpetuating the problem, but recognizing the pattern and breaking free from it were two entirely different challenges. Even though I could see how dysfunctional the situation had become, I still felt the overwhelming guilt and family pressure every time Amanda called in tears. I still heard my parents' voices reminding me how much Amanda needed support, how talented she was, how this rough patch was just temporary if we could all pull together to help her through it. The breaking point came during what should have been one of the happiest periods of my life. I had just received a job offer from a major tech company in Seattle, a position that would double my salary and give me the opportunity to work on cutting-edge software development projects. It was everything I had worked toward throughout college, the kind of career opportunity that could set me up for long-term financial security and professional fulfillment. But accepting the job required me to relocate across the country, and relocation was expensive. I needed money for a security deposit on a new apartment, moving costs, professional wardrobe upgrades, and living expenses while I waited for my first paycheck. After years of lending money to Amanda, my savings account was nearly empty, and I would need to take out another personal loan to cover the transition costs. I was in the middle of researching moving companies and apartment options when Amanda called with her latest crisis. This one was different from the others, bigger, more complicated, and potentially more permanent in its consequences. She was pregnant. The pregnancy was unplanned, the result of a brief relationship with someone she described as not father material. She had been hiding it from our parents for 2 months while she tried to decide what to do, but now she was starting to show and could no longer keep it secret. She needed money for prenatal care, for maternity clothes, for moving to a bigger apartment, for all the expenses that came with preparing for a baby. But more than that, she needed ongoing financial support for the foreseeable future. Photography work wasn't compatible with pregnancy and early motherhood, she explained. She would need help with living expenses for at least a year, maybe longer. She was talking about amounts that dwarfed all her previous requests, not $12,000 or $15,000, but potentially $50,000 or more spread over multiple years. I know it's a lot, Amanda said, and for the first time in years, she sounded genuinely scared rather than just desperate. But I don't have anyone else to turn to. Mom and Dad are already stretched thin, and I can't raise a baby without help. You're doing so well with your career, and you don't have any kids of your own to worry about. I wouldn't ask if I had any other option. As she spoke, I felt something shift inside me. For the first time in my adult life, I had a clear vision of my own future, the Seattle job, the career growth, the financial stability I had worked so hard to achieve. And for the first time, I could see exactly how much I would have to sacrifice to continue funding Amanda's choices. If I gave her the money she needed for the pregnancy and early motherhood, I would have to turn down the Seattle job. I couldn't afford both the relocation costs and Amanda's support payments. I would be stuck in my current position, watching my career stagnate, while Amanda became financially dependent on me for years to come. The realization was devastating and liberating at the same time. I finally understood that helping Amanda wasn't just about money, it was about choosing between her life and mine. Every dollar I gave her was a dollar I couldn't invest in my own future. Every crisis I solved for her was an opportunity I gave up for myself. I can't do it this time, I said quietly. The words felt strange in my mouth, foreign, after years of automatically saying yes to every request. But as soon as I spoke them, I felt a sense of relief I hadn't experienced in years. What do you mean you can't? Amanda asked, her voice rising with panic. You have a good job, you don't have any kids, you don't have a mortgage, you have more money than anyone else in the family. I have more money because I've worked for it and saved it, I replied, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. And I need that money for my own life, my own future. I got a job offer in Seattle, and I'm going to take it. The conversation that followed was unlike anything we had ever had as sisters. Amanda cried, argued, accused me of abandoning her in her time of greatest need. She pointed out all the times she had been there for me, though when pressed for specifics, she struggled to come up with examples that didn't involve me helping her rather than the other way around. She reminded me of how much our parents had sacrificed for both of us, conveniently omitting the vast disparity in how those sacrifices had been distributed. But for the first time, I didn't back down. I didn't apologize for having career goals that required financial resources. I didn't feel guilty for wanting to use my own money for my own life. I had finally reached the point where my desire for independence was stronger than my need for family approval. The fallout from that phone call was immediate and dramatic. Within hours, I received calls from both parents, their voices heavy with disappointment and confusion. How could I abandon my pregnant sister? How could I be so selfish when family needed me most? How could I choose a job over blood relatives? Their questions revealed assumptions I had never fully recognized before. They assumed my career was a luxury while Amanda's needs were necessities. They assumed my financial success created obligations to support other family members. They assumed that being responsible and capable meant I should want to sacrifice my own opportunities for the benefit of others. But most revealing was what they didn't ask. They didn't ask about my dreams, my goals, my vision for my own future. They didn't ask whether constantly bailing Amanda out was actually helping her or enabling her to avoid facing the consequences of her choices. They didn't ask whether the family financial dynamic was fair or sustainable in the long term. The conversation forced me to confront a truth I had been avoiding for years. My family loved me, but they didn't respect me as an independent person with my own legitimate needs and aspirations. They saw me as a resource to be managed, a problem solver who existed to handle crises they couldn't manage themselves. My success wasn't something they celebrated, it was something they counted on to fund their continuing support of Amanda's unsustainable lifestyle. That night, I sat in my Phoenix apartment and made a list of every dollar I had given to family members over the past 10 years. The total was staggering, over $40,000 in direct loans, not counting the opportunities I had missed because my savings were always depleted by the latest family crisis. $40,000 would have paid for graduate school, a house down payment, investments that could have grown substantially by now. Instead, that money had disappeared into the black hole of Amanda's financial irresponsibility, enabling her to continue making choices that required ever-increasing levels of family support. I had been subsidizing a lifestyle I couldn't afford for myself, funding dreams that came at the expense of my own. The realization was both heartbreaking and empowering. I finally understood that helping Amanda hadn't actually helped her at all. It had prevented her from learning to live within her means, from developing the skills necessary to support herself, from facing the natural consequences of her financial decisions. My loans hadn't been acts of love, they had been acts of enabling that hurt both of us in the long run. I accepted the Seattle job and began planning my move across the country. For the first time in my adult life, I was spending money on myself without guilt, investing in my own future without worrying about whether someone else needed the funds more urgently. It felt selfish and responsible at the same time, like learning to breathe after years of holding my breath. The weeks leading up to my move were tense and uncomfortable. My parents called less frequently, and when they did, the conversations were strained and awkward. Amanda stopped calling altogether, communicating only through hurt text messages that made it clear she felt betrayed and abandoned. The family group chat, which had once been filled with daily updates and shared photos, became a barren landscape of brief, polite exchanges. I had always feared that setting boundaries with my family would mean losing them entirely. But as I packed my belongings and prepared for my new life in Seattle, I realized that the relationships I was potentially losing had never been healthy or balanced to begin with. They had been built on my willingness to sacrifice my own needs for everyone else's convenience, and they couldn't survive my decision to prioritize my own well-being. The day I loaded my belongings into a moving truck and drove away from Phoenix, I felt a mixture of sadness and liberation. I was leaving behind my family, my childhood home, and the only life I had ever known. But I was also leaving behind a dynamic that had kept me financially and emotionally trapped for most of my adult life. Seattle welcomed me with rain and opportunity. The new job was everything I had hoped it would be: challenging, rewarding, and well compensated. I rented a studio apartment in Capitol Hill, bought my first new car, and started building a life that belonged entirely to me. For the first time in years, I had money in my savings account that I could count on being there next month. But the guilt and worry about my family never entirely disappeared. I wondered how Amanda was managing her pregnancy without my financial support. I wondered whether my parents were struggling to cover the expenses I had been handling. I wondered whether I had been selfish to prioritize my own career over their immediate needs. Those doubts became overwhelming 6 months after my move to Seattle, when I received a call that changed everything. It was Mom, and she was crying so hard I could barely understand her words. Dad had had a heart attack. He was in the hospital, stable but facing months of recovery and potential disability. The medical bills were mounting, and his insurance didn't cover everything. Worst of all, he might not be able to return to his job as an insurance adjuster, which meant their primary source of income was in jeopardy. "We hate to ask," Mom said through her tears, "but we don't know what else to do. We've already borrowed against the house twice to help Amanda, and we don't have any savings left. If we can't make the mortgage payments, we might lose everything." For the first time in years, my family needed help that wasn't related to Amanda's latest crisis. This was a genuine emergency, the kind of situation where family members should support each other without question. Dad's heart attack wasn't the result of poor financial planning or irresponsible choices, it was a medical catastrophe that could happen to anyone. But as I listened to Mom explain their desperate financial situation, I realized that their lack of savings wasn't entirely due to bad luck. They had spent the equity in their house and drained their retirement accounts to fund Amanda's lifestyle for years. The crisis was medical, but their inability to handle it financially was the direct result of choices they had made about how to distribute family resources. I was facing the same impossible situation I had wrestled with throughout my childhood, but now the stakes were higher than ever before. If I helped my parents, I would be enabling the same financial dysfunction that had controlled my entire life. If I didn't help them, they might lose their home and face poverty in their old age. The conversation I had with my parents that night was the most difficult of my life, but it was also the most honest. For the first time, I told them exactly how much money I had loaned Amanda over the years, and how little of it had been repaid. I explained how their constant financial crises had affected my own ability to build savings and plan for the future. I pointed out the disparity between the support they had given Amanda and the complete lack of support they had provided for my education and career development. Most importantly, I told them that I was willing to help with Dad's medical expenses, but only if they agreed to fundamentally change how the family handled money. No more loans to Amanda without a realistic repayment plan. No more using home equity to fund lifestyle choices. No more treating my financial success as a family resource rather than my personal achievement. The conditions I set were harsh but necessary. I would contribute $15,000 toward Dad's medical bills and help with mortgage payments for 6 months, while he recovered. In exchange, they had to sell their house and move to something they could afford on Mom's income alone. They had to stop giving Amanda money beyond genuine emergencies, and they had to acknowledge that their previous financial decisions had put them in this vulnerable position. It was the first time I had ever used my financial resources as leverage in family relationships, and it felt both empowering and terrible. But I also knew that continuing to enable their dysfunction wouldn't actually help anyone in the long term. If they couldn't learn to live within their means now, they would face the same crisis again in a few years, and I would be expected to bail them out once more. The family meeting where we discussed these conditions was brutal. Amanda, who had flown in from LA for Dad's medical emergency, was furious that I was holding Dad's health hostage to make a point about money. Mom was hurt that I was asking them to downsize their home while they were already dealing with a medical crisis. Dad, still weak from his heart attack, seemed overwhelmed by the financial realities he was facing for the first time. But underneath their anger and hurt, I could see a grudging recognition that I was right about the unsustainability of their previous choices. They had run out of other options, and my conditions were harsh but fair. They agreed to my terms, though it was clear they resented having to do so. Over the following months, I watched my family struggle with changes they should have made years earlier. My parents sold their house and moved into a modest apartment, using the proceeds to pay down their debts and establish a small emergency fund. Amanda was forced to move back home temporarily when she could no longer afford her LA lifestyle without family support, and she eventually found work as a part-time photography assistant while raising her baby. The changes were difficult for everyone, but they were also necessary. For the first time in years, my parents were living within their means, and Amanda was learning to support herself rather than relying on constant family bailouts. The financial pressure that had dominated every family conversation for decades was finally beginning to ease. As for me, I was learning what it felt like
To have a normal relationship with money and family. I helped when there were genuine emergencies, but I wasn't expected to fund lifestyle choices or rescue people from the consequences of their own decisions. I could save money for my own goals without worrying about whether someone else needed it more urgently. I could make career decisions based on what was best for my future rather than what would allow me to continue supporting family members. The guilt took longer to fade than I had expected. For months, I questioned whether I had been too harsh, too selfish, too demanding in my conditions for helping with Dad's medical crisis. But as I watched my family slowly adapt to their new reality, I began to see that the changes were good for everyone involved, not just for me. Amanda, in particular, seemed to be growing in ways that years of family financial support had never encouraged. Living within her means forced her to be creative about building her photography business, and she started finding clients and projects she never would have pursued when money was always available from family. Becoming a single mother was challenging, but she was proving to be more resourceful and resilient than any of us had given her credit for. My relationship with my parents improved as well. Once the constant financial pressure was removed from our interactions, we could have conversations about topics other than money, crises, and family obligations. They started asking about my work, my life in Seattle, my own dreams and goals, rather than just seeing me as a resource to be tapped when problems arose. The process of establishing boundaries with my family was the hardest thing I had ever done, but it was also the most important. It forced all of us to grow in ways that years of dysfunction had prevented, and it created space for healthier relationships built on mutual respect rather than financial dependency. Looking back, I wish I had learned these lessons earlier, before I had sacrificed so much of my own financial security and missed so many opportunities. But I also recognize that breaking generational patterns of dysfunction is never easy, and it often requires a crisis to create the motivation for real change. The most important thing I learned was that helping family members isn't always about giving them what they want, or even what they think they need. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable destructive patterns, even when that refusal feels harsh and selfish in the moment. Setting boundaries with family money was my first step toward building a life that belonged entirely to me. It was the beginning of learning to put my own needs first without guilt, to invest in my own future without apology, and to define my own relationship with both money and family on my own terms. The transformation wasn't immediate, and it wasn't pretty.
Those first few months in Seattle felt like living in a different world where I could actually plan for my own future without constantly calculating how much emergency money I needed to keep available for family crises. My new salary allowed me to not just survive, but to actually build something meaningful for myself. I opened a high-yield savings account and watched my balance grow week after week without anyone asking to borrow from it. For the first time in my adult life, I had financial breathing room, but the guilt was crushing. Every night, I would lie awake wondering if Amanda was okay, if she had enough money for prenatal vitamins, if my parents were struggling to cover expenses I used to handle. The rational part of my brain knew that my family's financial problems weren't my responsibility to solve, but the emotional part felt like I had abandoned people I loved when they needed me most. It's one thing to set boundaries in theory, but living with the consequences of those boundaries felt unbearable some days. The Seattle tech scene was everything I had hoped it would be professionally. My new company was working on artificial intelligence applications for healthcare, and I was finally using all the skills I had developed over years of studying and working in smaller firms. My colleagues treated me as an equal, valued my input, and included me in high-level strategic discussions. For the first time, I felt like I was building a career rather than just working a job to pay bills and fund family emergencies. But even as my professional life flourished, the family drama continued to unfold from a distance. Amanda had started a blog called Single Mom in LA, where she documented her pregnancy journey, and she wasn't shy about discussing her financial struggles. She never mentioned my name directly, but anyone who knew our family could tell she was writing about feeling abandoned by a wealthy sibling who had chosen career advancement over family loyalty. The posts got hundreds of comments from strangers offering support and criticizing unnamed family members who had turned their backs on a pregnant woman in need. My parents forwarded me some of these blog posts, I think hoping I would feel guilty enough to change my mind about helping Amanda financially. Instead, reading her public narrative made me realize how differently we had experienced our family dynamic. In Amanda's version of events, she was a struggling artist who had faced setbacks and bad luck, while I was the privileged sister who had gotten all the advantages and refused to share them. She genuinely seemed to believe that my financial success was somehow unearned or unfair, rather than the result of years of working multiple jobs and making sacrifices she had never been asked to make. The disconnect was so profound that I started questioning my own memories and perceptions. Had I really been treated so differently growing up, or had I imagined the disparity? Was I being selfish and cruel by refusing to help a pregnant sister, or was I finally setting healthy boundaries after years of enabling? The uncertainty was exhausting, but it also forced me to become more self-aware about my own motivations and choices. I started seeing a therapist in Seattle, partly to help process the family guilt, but also to understand why I had allowed the dynamic to continue for so long. Dr. Sarah Chen specialized in family systems therapy, and she helped me see patterns I had been too close to recognize. She introduced me to concepts like codependency, enabling, and financial abuse that gave me language for experiences I had never been able to articulate. Families often develop roles that serve the system rather than the individuals. Dr. Chen explained during one of our sessions. It sounds like you were cast as the responsible one who could handle anything, while Amanda was the creative one who needed protection from practical concerns. Those roles might have made sense when you were children, but they became problematic when they prevented both of you from developing a full range of life skills. The therapy sessions were revelatory in ways I hadn't expected. I started to understand that my compulsive need to solve other people's financial problems wasn't actually generosity, it was a way of maintaining control and feeling important within my family system. As long as I was the one with money to lend, I had a clear role and value. Setting boundaries meant risking the possibility that my family might not need or want me if I wasn't willing to be their financial safety net. But the therapy also helped me recognize that real love and support looked different from what I had been providing. Constantly rescuing Amanda from the consequences of her choices hadn't helped her develop resilience, problem-solving skills, or financial literacy. It had actually prevented her from growing into a fully functional adult who could support herself and her child. My loans had been enabling her dependency rather than fostering her independence. Meanwhile, my career in Seattle was advancing faster than I had ever imagined possible. Within 6 months, I was promoted to senior software engineer, and my salary increased by another $20,000. I was working on projects that challenged me intellectually and had the potential to make a real difference in people's lives. The healthcare AI applications we were developing could help doctors diagnose diseases earlier and more accurately, potentially saving thousands of lives. The work was meaningful in a way that my previous jobs had never been, partly because I wasn't constantly distracted by family financial emergencies. I could focus completely on my professional development, take on additional responsibilities, and invest time in learning new technologies. I was finally experiencing what it felt like to have a career rather than just a job. But success brought its own complications. The better I did professionally, the more my family seemed to resent my refusal to share the benefits with them. When I mentioned my promotion during a rare phone call with Mom, her response was notably cool. "That's nice, dear. I hope all that success is worth what it's costing you in terms of family relationships." The implication was clear: I was trading money for love, career advancement for family connection. The criticism stung because part of me worried it might be true. I was making more money than I had ever dreamed of, living in a beautiful city, working on fascinating projects, but I was also more isolated from my family than I had ever been. Some nights, I would walk through Pike Place Market or along the waterfront, surrounded by the energy and excitement of Seattle, but feeling profoundly alone because I had no one to share my successes with. The isolation was particularly acute during holidays and family milestones. When Amanda's baby was born, I learned about it through a Facebook post rather than a phone call. The baby, a little girl named Sophia, was beautiful, and Amanda looked genuinely happy in the hospital photos. I wanted to fly to LA to meet my niece, but I wasn't sure I would be welcome given the tension that had developed between us. I sent a gift instead, a substantial amount deposited into a college savings account I opened for Sophia, along with some practical baby items. It was my way of showing I cared about Amanda and the baby while maintaining the financial boundaries I had established. But Amanda's response was lukewarm at best. She thanked me politely, but noted that college savings wouldn't help with immediate expenses like diapers, formula, and medical bills. The gift was rejected as inadequate, which reinforced my growing understanding that no amount of money would ever be enough as long as my family viewed me primarily as a financial resource. They wanted ongoing support, not thoughtful contributions. They wanted me to fund their lifestyle choices rather than invest in long-term stability. The college fund for Sophia was exactly the kind of responsible financial planning that could make a real difference in a child's life, but it wasn't the immediate cash infusion that Amanda needed to maintain her current situation. That Christmas was the first one I spent entirely alone, and it was both depressing and liberating. I volunteered at a homeless shelter, served meals to people who were facing genuine hardship through no fault of their own, and gained perspective on what real financial crisis looked like. The people I served that day were grateful for basic necessities: a hot meal, a warm place to sleep, access to a shower. They weren't asking anyone to fund their lifestyle choices or cover the costs of irresponsible decisions, they just needed help getting back on their feet. The experience made me realize how different my family's financial problems were from genuine poverty or hardship. Amanda's crises always involved maintaining a lifestyle she couldn't afford rather than meeting basic survival needs. She needed money for expensive apartments, designer baby gear, organic food, yoga classes. Things that were nice to have but not essential for safety or well-being. The urgency of her requests came from wanting to avoid lifestyle downgrades, not from facing actual deprivation. When I returned to my empty apartment after volunteering at the shelter, I felt more confident about the boundaries I had set. I wasn't withholding help from someone in genuine need, I was refusing to subsidize choices that were beyond my family's means. There's a profound difference between those two situations, even though the emotional manipulation can make them feel the same. The new year brought unexpected developments that tested my resolve in ways I hadn't anticipated. Amanda's blog about single motherhood had gained a significant following, and she had started monetizing it through sponsored posts and affiliate marketing. She was earning decent money for the first time in years, but instead of using it to become more financially independent, she was using it to justify even more expensive lifestyle choices. The blog income allowed her to move into a bigger apartment in an even trendier neighborhood, upgrade her photography equipment, and hire a part-time nanny so she could focus on building her brand. She started posting about expensive baby products, designer maternity clothes, and luxury self-care treatments, all while continuing to present herself as a struggling single mother who needed family support. The contradiction was maddening. If she had enough money to afford luxury items and lifestyle upgrades, why was she still asking our parents for help with basic expenses? If her blog was generating income, why wasn't she using it to pay back the money she had borrowed over the years? The success of her online presence seemed to have made her feel entitled to an even higher standard of living, rather than grateful for the opportunity to become self-sufficient. But what bothered me most wasn't Amanda's spending choices, it was the narrative she was creating about our family. Her blog posts increasingly portrayed me as the villain in her story, the successful sister who had abandoned her family for money and career advancement. She never used my name, but she described our childhood in ways that painted herself as the neglected child and me as the favored one. According to her version of events, our parents had invested heavily in my education while ignoring her artistic talents, and I had used those advantages to build a successful career that I now refused to share with less fortunate family members. The revisionist history was so distorted that I barely recognized our actual childhood in her descriptions. But her followers ate it up, praising her for overcoming family rejection and building a successful life, despite lack of support from wealthy relatives. The comment sections were filled with people sharing their own stories of being abandoned by successful siblings, and Amanda had become something of an inspiration figure for people who felt overlooked or undervalued within their own families. Reading her blog posts felt like watching someone create an alternate reality where she was the victim and I was the perpetrator of some unnamed injustice. It was particularly painful because there were kernels of truth in her narrative. Our parents had invested more heavily in some of her interests than mine, and I was now more financially successful than the rest of my family. But she had twisted those facts into a story that completely ignored the years of financial support she had received, the opportunities she had been given, and the choices she had made that led to her current situation. The blog also revealed things about Amanda's financial situation that she had never shared with the family. She was earning thousands of dollars per month from sponsorships and advertising, far more than I had realized. She was also spending that money as quickly as it came in, upgrading her lifestyle to match her income without building any savings or paying down debt. The same financial patterns that had characterized her entire adult life were continuing, just on a larger scale. I screenshotted some of the posts that mentioned her income and forwarded them to my parents, not out of spite, but because I thought they should know that Amanda's requests for help weren't coming from someone who was genuinely struggling to make ends meet. If she was earning significant money from her blog, they deserved to know that before deciding how much additional support to provide. Mom's response was defensive and dismissive. "She's a new mother trying to build a business," Mom wrote back, "that income isn't guaranteed, and she needs stability while she's getting established. Just because she's had some success doesn't mean she doesn't need family support." It was the same logic that had governed every financial decision throughout our childhood. Amanda's needs were always urgent and legitimate, while practical concerns about sustainability or fairness were treated as heartless and unsupportive. The exchange with Mom crystallized something I had been struggling to understand for months. My family wasn't asking me to help with genuine emergencies or temporary setbacks. They were asking me to subsidize a lifestyle and financial approach that they believed Amanda was entitled to maintain, regardless of her actual earning capacity. The money I had refused to lend wasn't going to keep her and Sophia housed and fed, it was going to allow her to continue living beyond her means while building a personal brand based on the narrative of being an abandoned single mother. That realization was both liberating and heartbreaking. Liberating because it confirmed that my instincts about setting boundaries had been correct. Heartbreaking because it meant my family would probably never understand or respect my decision to prioritize my own financial stability. They were so invested in their version of reality that facts about Amanda's actual income and spending couldn't penetrate their perception of her as someone who needed protection and support. Spring in Seattle brought cherry blossoms, longer days, and a promotion that I had been working toward since arriving in the city. I was named lead engineer on a new project, developing AI applications for mental health diagnosis, a role that came with substantial salary increases and stock options. For the first time in my life, I was earning enough money to not just live comfortably but to build real wealth for my future. I celebrated the promotion by doing something I had never been able to do before. I bought myself a gift without calculating whether the money might be needed for a family emergency. It was a beautiful vintage guitar that I found in a music shop in Fremont, something I had wanted since college but never felt I could justify purchasing. Sitting in my apartment that night, playing simple chords on an instrument I had bought simply because it brought me joy, I finally understood what financial freedom actually felt like. But the celebration was short-lived. 2 days after my promotion was announced, I received a call from Dad that brought all the family drama rushing back into focus. He had been laid off from his insurance adjuster job, and Mom's hours at the bank had been reduced due to economic downturns. They were facing the possibility of foreclosure on their house, the same house they had mortgaged twice, to fund Amanda's various crises and lifestyle choices. "We hate to ask," Dad said, his voice heavy with embarrassment and desperation, "but we don't know what else to do. We've looked into every option, but we need about $30,000 to bring the mortgage current and keep the house. We know you're doing well with your new job, and we thought maybe you could help us the way we've always helped Amanda." The irony was staggering. For the first time, my parents were asking me for money to solve a problem that was directly caused by their previous decisions to lend money to Amanda. They had sacrificed their own financial security to fund her lifestyle, and now they were expecting me to sacrifice mine to fund theirs. The cycle of financial dysfunction was trying to perpetuate itself through another generation, with me stepping into the role they had played for Amanda. But there was also something different about this request. Unlike Amanda's crises, which always involved lifestyle choices and poor financial planning, my parents' situation was the result of job loss and economic factors beyond their control. They had made questionable decisions about borrowing against their house, but the immediate crisis was caused by genuine economic hardship rather than overspending or irresponsible behavior. The distinction mattered to me, both practically and ethically. I could help my parents weather a temporary economic setback without enabling long-term financial dysfunction, but I also knew that simply writing a check wouldn't solve the underlying problems that had made them vulnerable to this crisis in the first place. "I might be able to help," I told Dad carefully, "but we need to have an honest conversation about how the family handles money going forward. I can't keep bailing everyone out every few years when the same patterns keep repeating themselves." The family meeting that followed was the most difficult conversation we had ever had, but it was also the most honest. For the first time, we talked openly about money, about the disparity in support I had received compared to Amanda, about the consequences of their decision to repeatedly mortgage their house to fund her lifestyle, and about what needed to change for any of us to have financial stability in the long term. I agreed to help with the mortgage, but with conditions that would fundamentally alter how our family dealt with financial issues. No more loans to Amanda without a realistic repayment plan. No more using home equity to fund lifestyle choices for adult children. Complete transparency about family finances so everyone could make informed decisions about what kinds of support were actually sustainable.
Most importantly, I insisted that Amanda be part of the conversation and take some responsibility for the role her financial dependency had played in creating this crisis. If she was earning substantial money from her blog, she should be contributing to the family financial recovery rather than continuing to drain resources from parents who were now facing foreclosure because of loans they had made to support her over the years. The conversation was brutal, but it was also necessary. For the first time, our family was forced to confront the real costs of the financial dysfunction that had controlled our relationships for decades. And for the first time, I was able to help from a position of strength rather than resentment because I was choosing to contribute rather than being emotionally manipulated into it. Setting those boundaries and having those honest conversations was the beginning of building healthier relationships with my family. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight, but it was the start of something better than what we had before. I learned that you can love people without enabling their destructive patterns, and that sometimes the most caring thing you can do is refuse to participate in dynamics that hurt everyone involved. The most important lesson was that financial boundaries aren't about being selfish or uncaring, they're about creating space for everyone to grow into healthier, more responsible versions of themselves. By refusing to continue funding Amanda's lifestyle, I forced her to develop the skills and motivation necessary to support herself and her daughter. By insisting on conditions for helping my parents, I helped them avoid repeating the same mistakes that had created their current crisis. It took almost a year for the new family dynamics to stabilize, but when they did, our relationships were stronger and more authentic than they had ever been. We could have conversations that weren't dominated by financial crises, and I could share my successes without worrying that they would be seen primarily as opportunities for other people to ask for money. Learning to put my own needs first, without guilt, was the hardest and most important thing I ever did. It saved my career, my financial future, and ultimately my relationships with the people I love most. Sometimes the most generous thing you can do for your family is refuse to enable their worst impulses, even when
That refusal feels cruel in the moment. The transformation in my family's financial habits wasn't immediate, and it certainly wasn't without resistance. After I agreed to help my parents avoid foreclosure in exchange for complete transparency and new boundaries around money, the real work began. Amanda was furious when she learned that part of my conditions included her contributing to the family's financial recovery. She had grown so accustomed to being on the receiving end of family financial support that the idea of giving back felt like a betrayal of everything she thought she deserved. "You're punishing me for being creative and following my dreams," Amanda said during one particularly heated phone call. "Just because you chose a boring corporate job doesn't mean everyone else should sacrifice their artistic vision for money." The comment revealed so much about how she viewed our different life paths. In her mind, my financial success was the result of selling out rather than working hard, while her financial struggles were the inevitable cost of being an artist, rather than the consequence of poor financial planning. But Mom and Dad were finally ready to have honest conversations about money, partly because they were facing the very real possibility of losing their home. For the first time, they acknowledged that their pattern of borrowing against the house to fund Amanda's lifestyle had been unsustainable. They admitted that they had treated my financial stability as a family resource, rather than respecting it as my personal achievement. Most importantly, they recognized that their well-intentioned support had actually prevented Amanda from developing the skills she needed to support herself and her daughter. The family financial recovery plan we developed was comprehensive and frankly overdue. My parents would downsize to a smaller house they could afford on their reduced income, using the equity to pay off their remaining debts and establish an emergency fund. Amanda would contribute a percentage of her blog income to help with the transition costs and to begin repaying some of the money they had loaned her over the years. Most importantly, all future financial assistance would be structured as formal loans with written agreements and realistic repayment schedules. Implementing these changes was harder than negotiating them had been. Amanda's blog income was irregular, and she had already committed to expensive lifestyle choices that made it difficult for her to contribute meaningfully to the family recovery. She was locked into a lease on her trendy apartment, had signed contracts for childcare and photography equipment, and had built her personal brand around a level of consumption that required every dollar she earned. The disconnect between her public persona and her private financial reality became even more apparent as we worked through the details of the family plan. On her blog, Amanda presented herself as a successful entrepreneur who was building a sustainable business while raising her daughter as a single mother. But in family financial meetings, it became clear that she was still living paycheck to paycheck despite earning substantial money from sponsorships and advertising. She had fallen into the same trap that had characterized her entire adult life. As her income increased, her expenses increased even faster. The blog money that should have provided financial security instead funded an escalating lifestyle that left her just as dependent on family support as she had been when she was earning nothing at all. It was the same pattern on a larger scale with higher stakes and more public visibility. The most challenging aspect of establishing new family financial boundaries was dealing with Amanda's sense of entitlement and victimization. She genuinely believed that her artistic pursuits and single motherhood made her deserving of ongoing family support regardless of her actual income or spending choices. When we pointed out that she was earning more money than Dad had ever made at his insurance job, she insisted that creative income was different because it was unpredictable and required constant reinvestment. Every practical suggestion we made was met with explanations about why it wouldn't work for someone in her unique situation. Moving to a less expensive neighborhood would hurt her brand. Reducing her spending on photography equipment would limit her professional growth. Getting a part-time job for additional security would take time away from building her business. She had an answer for everything, but none of her answers involved actually living within her means or taking responsibility for her financial choices. The breakthrough came when Sophia, Amanda's daughter, got sick and needed medical treatment that wasn't fully covered by insurance. Amanda called me in a panic, asking for $3,000 to cover the medical bills, and for the first time I said yes immediately without any conditions or hesitation. It was a genuine emergency involving the health and safety of my niece, exactly the kind of situation where family should support each other without question. But what happened next changed everything. Instead of using the money I sent for Sophia's medical bills, Amanda used it to pay her rent and covered the medical expenses by asking our parents for additional money. She had essentially double-dipped, using her daughter's illness to extract money from multiple family members for different purposes. When I discovered what had happened, I was angrier than I had ever been in my life. The confrontation that followed was brutal but necessary. I called Amanda and demanded an explanation for why she had lied about how she was using the money I had sent. Her response was a masterclass in manipulation and deflection. She claimed that all of her expenses were interconnected, so it didn't matter which specific bills were paid with which money. She accused me of being obsessive about details when a child's health was involved. She suggested that my anger proved I didn't really care about Sophia's well-being, only about controlling how money was spent. But I wasn't backing down this time. I had learned enough about financial boundaries and emotional manipulation to recognize what was happening. Amanda was using her daughter's medical needs to justify her own financial irresponsibility, and she was counting on my love for Sophia to override my concern about being deceived. It was the same pattern that had controlled our family relationships for decades, just with higher stakes and more sophisticated tactics. "This is exactly why I stopped lending you money in the first place," I told her. "You can't be trusted to use financial help for its intended purpose. You treat family money as a general slush fund for whatever you want to spend it on, regardless of what crisis you use to justify asking for it." Amanda's response was to threaten to cut off my access to Sophia unless I apologized and resumed providing financial support without conditions. It was the nuclear option, using her daughter as emotional leverage to force me back into the old family dynamic. The threat was particularly painful because I had been hoping to develop a relationship with my niece that wasn't mediated by financial transactions or family drama. But threatening to weaponize a child's relationship with family members was the line that even my parents weren't willing to let Amanda cross. Mom called me later that day to apologize for Amanda's behavior and to assure me that they wouldn't support any attempt to use Sophia as a bargaining chip in financial negotiations. It was the first time my parents had ever explicitly chosen my side over Amanda's in a family conflict, and it marked a real turning point in how our family dealt with her manipulative tactics. The incident also forced Amanda to confront some uncomfortable truths about how her behavior was affecting her daughter. Sophia was now old enough to understand that money was a source of constant conflict in her family, and she was beginning to internalize the message that her needs were somehow burdensome or problematic. Amanda's blog followers had no idea that her heartwarming posts about single motherhood were funded by elaborate financial manipulation of family members, or that her daughter was growing up surrounded by anxiety about money despite living a privileged lifestyle. For the first time, Amanda seemed to realize that her financial choices weren't just affecting her own life, they were creating an unhealthy environment for Sophia and poisoning relationships with family members who genuinely wanted to help when help was actually needed. The recognition didn't lead to immediate change, but it planted seeds of awareness that would eventually grow into better decision-making. My parents, meanwhile, were making remarkable progress in rebuilding their financial stability. They had downsized to a modest two-bedroom house that they could afford on Mom's income alone, and Dad had found part-time work that supplemented their finances without overwhelming his health limitations. For the first time in years, they were living within their means and building a small emergency fund instead of constantly borrowing against their future to fund current crises. The change in their stress levels was dramatic and immediate. Without the constant pressure of mortgage payments they couldn't afford and family financial emergencies they felt obligated to solve, they seemed younger and more relaxed than I had seen them in decades. They started talking about retirement plans, vacation dreams, and hobbies they wanted to pursue, conversations that had been impossible when every spare dollar was going to Amanda's latest crisis. They also started treating me differently, with more respect for my autonomy and more appreciation for my achievements. Instead of seeing my success primarily as an opportunity to ask for money, they began expressing genuine pride in my career advancement and personal growth. Our conversations became more balanced, with them asking about my life and interests rather than just updating me on family financial problems. The change was particularly noticeable during holidays and family visits. For the first time, I could come home without worrying that every interaction would somehow lead to a request for money or a guilt trip about not being more generous with family members. We could have normal conversations about work, relationships, current events, and shared interests without the underlying tension of unresolved financial issues. Amanda's adjustment to the new family dynamics was slower and more resistant, but even she eventually began to adapt. The combination of losing access to family financial support and facing the practical realities of single motherhood forced her to develop skills she had never needed before. She learned to budget, to prioritize expenses, to find creative ways to reduce costs without sacrificing her professional goals. Most importantly, she began to understand the difference between wants and needs, and to make financial decisions based on long-term sustainability rather than immediate desires. The process was difficult and sometimes painful, but it was also empowering in ways that years of family financial support had never been. For the first time in her adult life, Amanda was truly independent and self-sufficient. Her blog evolved as well, becoming more honest about the challenges of financial responsibility and the mistakes she had made in the past. Instead of presenting herself as a victim of family abandonment, she began writing about learning to support herself and her daughter without relying on others. The change in tone attracted a different kind of audience, people who were interested in practical advice about building financial stability rather than just sympathy for someone facing hardship. The new direction was more authentic and ultimately more successful than her previous approach. Readers responded positively to her honesty about past financial mistakes and her genuine efforts to build a sustainable lifestyle. The blog income became more consistent as she developed expertise in areas like budgeting for single parents, building creative careers, and balancing financial responsibility with personal fulfillment. By the end of that transformative year, our family looked completely different from the dysfunctional system that had controlled our relationships for so long. My parents were financially stable and emotionally healthier. Amanda was learning to support herself and her daughter without constant family bailouts. I was able to maintain loving relationships with all of them without sacrificing my own financial security or enabling destructive patterns. The change hadn't been easy for anyone involved, and there had been moments when it seemed like the family might not survive the transition. But by forcing ourselves to confront the underlying issues instead of just managing the symptoms, we had created space for everyone to grow into healthier, more responsible versions of themselves. I continued to thrive in my career in Seattle, eventually becoming a director of engineering and earning more money than I had ever imagined possible. But more importantly, I had learned to enjoy my success without guilt and to use my resources in ways that aligned with my values. I invested in my own future, contributed to causes I cared about, and helped family members in ways that were sustainable and healthy for everyone involved. The scholarship fund I had established for computer science students at Arizona State University grew substantially as my income increased, and I began mentoring young women who were interested in technology careers. Giving back felt different when it came from abundance rather than guilt, and I was able to make a real difference in people's lives without sacrificing my own well-being. My relationship with Sophia, my niece, also evolved in positive ways as Amanda became more financially stable and emotionally mature. Without the constant stress of money problems and family conflicts, Amanda was a better mother and Sophia was growing up in a healthier environment. I was able to be a supportive aunt who contributed to her education and development without being seen primarily as a source of emergency funding. The lessons I learned about financial boundaries and family dynamics have shaped every aspect of my life since then. I've been able to build healthy romantic relationships because I understand the difference between supportive partnership and financial codependency. I've made better career choices because I'm not constantly worried about maintaining enough liquid savings to handle family emergencies. I've been able to plan for my own future because I'm not perpetually sacrificing my long-term goals to solve other people's short-term problems. Most importantly, I've learned that love and financial support aren't the same thing, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's destructive patterns. The family I have now is smaller and less dramatic than the one I grew up with, but it's also more honest, more respectful, and more sustainable in the long term. The journey from financial doormat to empowered family member was long and painful, but it was also necessary for everyone involved. By refusing to continue participating in dysfunctional patterns, I forced my family to develop healthier ways of relating to each other and to money. The result was relationships built on mutual respect rather than financial dependency, and that foundation has proven strong enough to weather the normal challenges that all families face. Looking back, I wish I had learned these lessons earlier before I had sacrificed so many opportunities and so much of my own financial security to fund other people's lifestyle choices. But I also recognize that some lessons can only be learned through experience, and that breaking generational patterns of dysfunction is never easy or quick. The most important thing I want other people to understand is that setting financial boundaries with family isn't selfish or cruel, it's necessary for everyone's long-term well-being. When you constantly rescue people from the consequences of their poor decisions, you prevent them from learning the skills they need to make better choices in the future. When you sacrifice your own financial security to fund other people's lifestyle choices, you create a dynamic where everyone loses in the long run. Real love sometimes means saying no. Real support sometimes means letting people struggle with problems they've created for themselves. Real family relationships are built on mutual respect and shared responsibility, not on one person constantly sacrificing their own needs to meet everyone else's wants. The family I have now isn't perfect, but it's honest and sustainable and based on genuine care for each other's well-being rather than financial manipulation. My parents are proud of my achievements and respect my boundaries. Amanda is learning to support herself and her daughter independently while maintaining her creative pursuits. Sophia is growing up in an environment where money is managed responsibly rather than being a constant source of stress and conflict. And I've built a life that belongs entirely to me, a career I love, financial security I've earned through my own efforts, and relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial dependency. It took years to get here and the journey wasn't always pleasant, but the destination has been worth every difficult conversation and every moment of guilt I had to push through to maintain healthy boundaries. The greatest gift I gave myself wasn't the money I saved by refusing to fund Amanda's lifestyle, it was the permission to put my own needs first without apology. That lesson has shaped every aspect of my life since then, from career decisions to relationship choices to how I spend my time and energy. Learning to value myself enough to demand respect from others was the foundation for everything good that followed. Sometimes people ask me if I ever regret the years of family conflict that resulted from setting financial boundaries, and the answer is always no. Those boundaries didn't destroy my family, they saved it. They forced all of us to grow into better versions of ourselves, and they created space for genuine love and respect to flourish without being poisoned by resentment and financial manipulation. The family that emerged from that difficult transition is smaller and quieter than the one I grew up with, but it's also healthier, more honest, and more sustainable. We support each other in ways that build everyone up rather than enabling anyone's worst impulses. We celebrate each other's successes without resentment and help each other through genuine crises without creating dependency. That's what real family looks like, not constant crisis and drama and financial manipulation, but steady support and honest communication and mutual respect for each other's autonomy. It took me nearly 30 years to understand the difference, but once I did, everything changed for the better. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.